Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Koleka Putuma's play Mbuzeni. So this is a South African play that aims to challenge standard dramatic representations of Black South African women, which Putuma herself is. And one of the things she says in her critical introduction to this play is that throughout my undergraduate program at the University of Cape Town, the inability to source plays published from 2004 to 2014 by Black South African women playwrights to stage and perform perturbed me for two main reasons. The first being that Black women currently making original work exist, some who also identify as playwrights. The second being that I began to notice that Black female narratives were reliant on authorial prejudices in texts that were written by Black and white men, as well as by white women playwrights. I was bothered by how these narratives were still detained in stereotypes and how the Black female in these narratives could not exist as an agent of her own identity and destiny. Currently, there aren't enough narratives that counter the plot we often see staged for the Black female body. Ultimately, my aim with Mbuzeni was and still is to place the untold Black female narrative at the forefront of South African theater. I wanted the audience to allow the Black girl child their obsessions and experiences, especially as bodies and lives which are constantly subjected to an imposed narrative from birth. So that's the objective of this play, right, is to challenge the limited range of representations of Black women in South African theater. So these things often still depend on colonial era and quite racist stereotypes of Black women, and this is really problematic. So often these narratives, in my comparatively limited experience of reading South African theater, which I think is generally quite brilliant, they will often come down to things like Black women are wives to Black men. Black women are concubines. I mean, that's maybe a slightly sort of antiquated way of putting it, but Black women are in some sort of relationship with an unequal power dynamic with white men, or they are attempting to get that for material and social advantage. Sometimes Black women are portrayed as revolutionaries in the anti-apartheid struggle, but typically there's a fairly limited range, or Black women are merely background and supporting characters. And so one of the things that Mbuzeni tries to do is to present an alternative perspective. And so it follows this set of orphaned children, I think between ages roughly 10 and 13. I was going to say 9 and 12, but 10 and 13, according to the character descriptions. And they live in this very sort of uncertain situation because this group of orphans all lives together in one little house or shack or whatever it is. They seem to live on the other side of a cemetery from the rest of the town. But the uncertainty is exactly what this situation is. So there's some hints that this may be a version of the afterlife and that they are already dead, and that this is some sort of strange either afterlife as such, like heaven or hell or something like this, or that this is, or a more neutral afterlife, or that they are ghosts, something like this. There's some hints about that, but it's not clear. And so that's one of the sort of delightful ambiguities of this play. But these girls are obsessed with funerals. They're obsessed with death. Their game, their primary game that they seem to play, is burying one another in the cemetery. Not like actually burying, but like they will go into the cemetery, they will dig a hole, one girl will lie down and pretend to be a dead person. And so we have this game that they really enjoy, but it's also a source of tension among them, primarily because the youngest girl, Tinky, is the one who they always want to bury. Like, she is the one that is always made to go in the grave. And so she never gets to participate in the mourning or the sort of ritual aspects of the burial because she always has to be the dead person. And she resents this, in part because the older girls will often run off and leave her in the grave, even though she says to them specifically, do not leave me here. And they do it anyway. So this becomes this source of tension in addition to being their fascination, right? This thing that they do over and over, almost compulsively. And so that's actually one kind of argument for seeing this as a play about ghosts rather than about living people, because there is a theory of ghosts, or a version of ghosts, in which ghosts will sort of replay their trauma, replay their deaths often over and over and over again. And so they just sort of come back in ghostly form to redo the thing that led to the end of their life. So there is a sort of repetition compulsion to it that aligns somewhat with the nature of ghosts. But again, it's unclear. Like, it's very easy also to see these characters as living beings. But they also live in a world that's highly stratified along various lines. One of which, and of course that comes down to power dynamics on the one hand, but it also deals with questions of how a society engages with its members, right? How does a society as a collective experience particularly people without institutional power or positions, like young women, orphans in particular? So we get this right from the very beginning. We have the prologue performed by Gogo, who is one of the, I think, the oldest of the orphans. Oh, no, sorry. Never mind. So Gogo, who is also the narrator, is this sort of grandmother type figure who seems to observe the girls but doesn't really interact with them. And she is played by the same actor who plays Tinky, who's the youngest of the orphans. So there's a lot of doubling of the cast here. So Gogo opens, the preset says, an old woman in a dim light, and then it opens, this is the cemetery of this village. The villagers who live on this side of the cemetery, she points to the left, come here to pay their respects and remember those who have passed on to the other side. On this other side of the cemetery are 4 orphan girls who make a mockery of this sacred place. The two sides do not get along very much. The cemetery separates the girls from the villagers. The cemetery also separates the living from those who have died. The girls live in an abandoned shack built by a man we all know as Tata Sticks, who died mysteriously years ago. When the sun sets, I cross the cemetery to watch them play these burials, fascinated by weeping and burying each other. Sometimes they sneak over to our side when we are asleep to steal our leftovers. They think that we do not see them, but we do, or at least I do. They saw me once watching them. Usually I'm not one to concern myself with other people's business, but there is something rather strange and unsettling about these children. The villagers pass around many stories about how these orphans came to live in that hole away from all this life, but I wonder and wonder, and I still do not know. I simply don't. So, again, there's these issues of like social stratification, right? The gap between the villagers and these orphans is physically marked by the presence of the cemetery, but it is a permeable barrier, right? The barrier itself is also separate and distinct from the two social sides, but each side enters into the cemetery for their own purposes. For the orphans, that is to play at the rituals of a funeral. For the villagers, that is genuinely to bury those who have passed on. And the girls pass through the cemetery into the village. So the barrier itself is quite permeable, which is an interesting symbol for the social stratification of South Africa, right? Because under apartheid, racial barriers were quite distinct and quite solid, right? Like if you were black or colored, there was very little possibility of permeating into the social stratas exclusively reserved for whites. Now, in post-apartheid South Africa, there are still substantial social barriers, but those are more often tied to property and wealth, which of course do still correlate strongly with race, right? White South Africans on average tend to be wealthier than black or colored South Africans, but the barriers are more permeable. Black people in South Africa are much more likely today to rise to the highest levels of government than they were under apartheid. So you do still have these sort of issues. But we also have this sort of question of the ambiguity around how this state of affairs came to be and what motivates these girls. And I think that's the other really interesting sort of question at the heart of Putuma's project here is, if this is a play, as she says in her critical introduction, fundamentally concerned with the lives of Black South African women and portraying them, experiencing them, working through them in non-stereotype-based ways, then that raises the question of what that means, right? What are the interior lives of South African women, of Black South African women, apart from media constructed racist and colonialist stereotypes? And so this play becomes an exploration of that.